We're going to talk about Bodhi Day, December 8th. And I always have a sponsor. This talk is being sponsored by everydaybuddhist.org. That's our online school. And a lot of this material comes from this course from Siddhartha to Shakyamuni, the arc of the Buddha's life. And this story all takes place in northeastern India. Some of it's in Nepal now. I've told you before, sometimes people get really snarky on the internet, and people will say the Buddha was born in northeast India. Today it's India. It used to be Nepal or Tibet. So, it depends on what map you're using. And then a lot of this material comes from this book, Gautama Buddha, by Hajime Nakamura. So this is a very good book. Volume 1, really good. So there's 3 major holidays in Buddhism. So the first one's Hanuman City on April 8th, and we have a big festival for that, right? And I've showed you this picture before. This is the Buddha's mother and father when he was Prince Siddhartha. King Suddhodana was his father. Queen Maya was his mother. And then his aunt, who is very important in Buddhism. She's considered the first woman of Buddhism. She's considered like the most important woman in Buddhism, Mahapajapati. And I told you before, his father looks like Freddie Mercury from Queen, but it's just a coincidence. There's no meaning in that. So real quick, Queen Maya she wants to have a child, and she's having trouble conceiving. And one night she dreams of a white elephant, which is it's like a rabbit's foot or a rainbow in our tradition. It's a sign of good luck. And it's not literal, but it signals to the audience that something good's going to happen. And that's why we roll the white elephant out for Hanuman City Festival. And I told you that's been my job for the last 5 or 6 years. I really like it. He's over hibernating in the kodo right now. And then I put both hands on his bottom and I roll him out. And I haven't hit any door jambs or doorknobs. There's no nicks. So that's gone well. And then Siddhartha's born. And this is a legendary story. In a sense, it's rebirth, in a sense, kind of symbolic of rebirth. And he takes 7 steps, transcending the 6 realms that Reverend Harada talked about a week or 2 ago in adult study. So he doesn't literally walk and talk, but this is a foreshadowing of his life story. So we have Hanuman City, and today we have Bodhi Day, December 8th. So now the Buddha is around, he's in his mid-20s, 28, 29, and he leaves home. He wants to seek spiritual depth in his life. He's beginning to question materialism. He wants to find authenticity and meaning in his life. And Kanthaka is his manservant, and Chana is his servant. Kanthaka was the white horse. He cuts his hair. He dons the robes of a monk, saffron robes, and he gives up all of his silks and jewelry. And then, this is kind of an important thing. He practices for 6 years, nonstop, every day. So, if you think you're not making good progress and it's only been a couple years, you're doing fine, right? Because, I couldn't practice every day, 24 hours a day. So, it took me longer than 6 years. It takes longer. But the Buddha decides to give up on asceticism and yogic practices, and he builds this little straw platform he can sit on, and he's going to meditate under the Bodhi tree until he realizes insight. And what he realizes is that all things are impermanent and everything's flowing, and that was the beginning of Buddhism. But he's very weak from asceticism and not eating, and this woman, Sujata, brings him some sweetened milk, and he eats that and gains his strength and is able to continue meditating and realize awakening on December 8th. So this is, he eats the sweetened milk, he goes into practice and meditates, and then under the Bodhi tree, early in the morning, with the morning star rising and the sun coming up, he realizes the truth of impermanence in his life, and that this becomes the basis of his spiritual practice. This is probably like the only real doctrinal, foundational teaching we have in Buddhism, is that all things are impermanent and everything's related. So we've done one of them. We've done the second one. So the third one is called Nirvana Day. And a lot of traditions celebrate this on February 8th, which I really think is cool because I'm a math person. And I'd really like it if it was 888, right? Because patterns mean things to me because I like numbers. But in our tradition, it's February 15th. And I've mentioned before at Gardena, one of the Dharma school teachers corrected me. So in our tradition, it's February 15th. And so after the Buddha realizes enlightenment on December 8th, he begins to teach the Dharma from 35 years on. And he teaches till he's 80 years old. And when he reaches 80, he has another meal. So you can kind of see there's parallel structure here. Like, I really think the sutras are storyboarded. I really think they storyboard these stories and they place things in the story to have meaning. So I don't think it's a coincidence that we have another meal coming. And it turns out to be a meal from Kunda, who is a blacksmith. And I always think it's dangerous to have a blacksmith cook your meal for you. So they think it was bad pork, but the Buddha was 80 years old, he was weak, and he gets food poisoning. And it takes 3 or 4 days, and he dies a very human death. But before he dies, he's in this position now. So rather than sitting facing to the east, realize awakening at 35, he's lying down with his head pointing north, facing the west. So what's in the west? The Pure Land. So this is just basic Buddhism. So I like the way the temple was built. That's north. That's west. So I can put the... And I'm going to turn... this guy east. So practice starts in the east and it ends in the west. Like this. So that's going on here too, just like the sun. So I want to kind of explain that I think in Buddhism, these two events, the awakening at 35 and realizing nirvana at 80 has been kind of conflated. I think these two are mixed up. When people say, when the Buddha reached awakening, I think everybody just assumes it was a big bang that happened at 35. But there was really two events. There's one at 35, and then there's complete awakening at 80. So you could think that he realizes insight at 35, practices for 45 years, and realizes complete and perfect awakening right before his death. So I think the holidays have been named wrong. I think Bodhi Day is really Nirvana Day. This is when the Buddha first realized awakening. And what we call Nirvana Day is technically called Party Nirvana Day. So Pari means complete. Nirvana means to blow out a candle. And Party Nirvana means to be completely remove all combustible materials. There's no chance for greed, anger, and ignorance to develop. And so we have these two separate events. It's called the two Nirvana Theory. And then the way the story is constructed, again, you have the Buddha facing east, and then at 35, and then you have him facing west at the end of his life when he realizes complete parinirvana before he dies. And so there's kind of this metaphor of the sun. You know, practice begins in the east and it moves across the sky in a very orderly path until it sets at the end of our life in the West. So in the textbooks and in the sutras, they make it very clear which nirvana they're talking about. I've noticed this in the texts. I mean, in English, we're not very clear, but in the sutras, it's very, very clear. So I wanted to show you. So this is the way they talk about it. It's nirvana in the morning, facing east. And they also refer to it as under the Bodhi tree. They also refer to it as awakening with remainder. Like the Buddha was no longer overrun by emotions. He no longer was acting out, but he still had that within him. He didn't become something divine. He was still a human being. He would still have anger, ignorance, and greed, but the difference now is that it didn't last long, and he wasn't overwhelmed by it. It's manageable, but he wasn't completely without emotions or feelings. And they also use the word partial enlightenment or partial awakening. And then this one, they always refer to it as Party Nirvana. It's always in the evening, not in the morning. So again, you wake up in the morning and the day ends in the evening. So we kind of have this sun metaphor. And he's always facing west. And they refer to this in different ways. They refer to it, rather than under the Bodhi tree, it's under the twin sala trees. So it's hard to tell, but there's two trees. There's a tree on either side of him. And they also refer to it as awakening without remainder. There's no remainder of anger, ignorance, or greed. He's completely free now that he's beginning to lose form and return back to suchness. And it's also called perfect enlightenment. So these things are important to remember, I think. And I think it has a lot to do with different traditions. One thing our tradition says a lot that I think is bad marketing is we'll say, we're the one Buddhist school where you can't realize Buddhahood in this life. But all the other schools say, oh yeah, come to our school, you can realize Buddhahood in this life. So I would totally want to go there. But the difference is, I think, is when we say you can't realize Buddhahood in this life, we mean complete and total perfect awakening before death, where you're absolutely free from ignorance, anger, and greed. You have no clinging whatsoever. You're completely free. That doesn't happen until the end of life. And I think when Zen people say you could realize awakening in this body, in this life, I think they're talking about the one under the Bodhi tree, where you realize insight, and now your emotions are manageable. You're self-reflective, you're self-aware. You see anger coming, and you're able to let it go. But you still have the same wants and desires. You're still the same basic person you were before. It's just that you see it clearly now. And the reason why this is confusing, too, is nirvana means to extinguish, to blow out. And in America, when I think of blowing out a candle, the fire is completely gone, right? So when I think of nirvana under the Bodhi tree means blowing out the candle. In America, that metaphor sounds like all his anger, ignorance, and greed is completely gone. He's perfectly enlightened. That's what I thought. But I read that in India, they understand this metaphor differently from us. Like, remember I told you once that in Spanish, dogs don't say bow wow? And like, we say cock-a-doodle-doo for roosters. I think in Spanish, it's like chick, chick, chicory or something. I mean, they say the same thing, but they write it differently. They capture it with different sounds. So in India, it's understood that the active fire is out, but there's a latent fire. There's like still potential energy in the candle. The fuel is still there. It may not be burning right now, but the combustion is very likely because we still have the fuel. So this is this two-stage thing. Under the Bodhi tree, we've successfully blown out the candle, but not until the end of our lives do we completely remove the fuel. So it's almost like having a gallon of gas in your garage for your lawnmower. You know, if you put that next to the heater or the water heater or the gas dryer, you know, your house isn't on fire, but it's not a good idea. There's still a potential for it to combust. So this metaphor is a little bit more two-staged in India than it is in the United States. And then I'm going to give you some doctrinal textual proof. This is one of the lines we just chanted for the Sambutsuge. It went by quickly, but we said mu myo yokunu seison yomu. And this got translated into English as ignorance, greed, and anger, the three flames, are completely absent in the world honored one. So this kind of sounds like he's completely free of any defilements at 35. But if you translate each Chinese character, mu is a negator, it means no. And then myo means light, greed and anger. So this is kind of neat. No light means ignorance. So this is ignorance, greed, and anger, the three poisons. And then seison, we always chant that. That means world honored. Seison. So that's the world honored one. That's the Buddha. But then here, this character yo means to last, duration. So it's negating the idea of duration. So in the Buddha, these three poisons, they don't last long. So it's not that they're completely absent. They just don't last long. So from 35 to 80, they don't last long. And from 80 on, they're completely absent. And then the last example I'd like to show you is in the larger sutra, there's 48 vows. Reverend Rod has talked about this. They're kind of in this structure. When I get to the NBA, if I can't shoot above 30% from the arc, may I never become an all-star. It's in that format. It's always, once I do this, if I can't do that, then I'll never do this. It's a little confusing. I think it's a contrapositive. It's a little confusing. So, but what's interesting about it is the Buddha says, when I attain Buddhahood under the Bodhi tree, if countless Buddhas throughout the 10 directions should not praise my name and say Namo Amida Butsu, may I not attain perfect enlightenment. So even in the 48 vows in the larger sutra, this really confused me. I mean, is he a Buddha or is he not a Buddha? I mean, he says he attained Buddhahood, and then he says he won't attain Buddhahood. And I found that very confusing, but it's because those are two separate things, right? The first one's under the Bodhi tree, and the second one is at 80 years old when we pass away. So at many of the funerals we have, it'll say our loved one entered Nirvana, and then they list the date of death. But technically, they're entering Party Nirvana, complete and total removal of all our foolish and ignorant and deluded ideas when we pass away. Once we lose our form, there's no clinging. So I like this story a lot because sometimes Jodo Shinshu is presented as something unique and on an island. Something like, it almost sounds like Shinran was super creative and he kind of just created the Pure Land ideas out of whole cloth. But this is just basic general Buddhism. And what Shinran is doing is he's emphasizing those notes. There's lots of different notes in Buddhism, and he's emphasizing these notes. And I think for himself, he really realized insight into who he was. And it's almost a paradox. The more you see your anger, ignorance, and greed, the less it takes over. The more self-aware you are, the less it has an effect on you. Like, you only really get in trouble when you lose your temper and you say something cruel and then you kind of realize it an hour later. That's when you get in trouble. But if you feel it welling up, you can take a breath and let it go. And so it's the acting out that stops. But those emotions are still there. You're still fully human. You're not a deity. And there's quotes like this where the Buddha tended to be deified, like a fish story. In an oral tradition, as you tell the Buddha's life story, it kind of got grander and grander, and the Buddha became less like you and me and more like a deity or someone unique in human history. And there's scholarship and texts that kind of refute that as a later interpretation of a more human story. So you could think of the Buddha as reaching Shinjin at 35, deep insight into his life. He practices for 45 years, and at death, he realizes Party Nirvana, complete, perfect enlightenment, and goes to the Pure Land. So, please join me in Gasho. Namo Amitabha. Naman Daos. Naman Daos. Naman.